that they and start the session. First of all, let me welcome everybody. Thank you very much for those of you who are with us, and I'm sure more people will join as we go along. I don't intend to interrupt the meeting to welcome them, so hopefully they'll see that I'm welcoming everybody coming onto the session at the beginning. We have participants from all around the world. So we've got Jack sitting at 6 o'clock in the morning in US, and we've got Stephen in Hong Kong at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And luckily for me, it being in the middle, it's noon UK time. And wherever you are, I hope you're well set up. Let me introduce myself. My name is Masood Golshani. I'm one of the administrators for the Scythian group. It's my pleasure to play the role of facilitator for today's webinar of our experts. I have a general interest in archery, and I have an interest in history, although I'm not a professional person in those fields the way that the two experts that we're going to be talking to are going to be today. This is going to be part of a series of webinars that we would like to do on the Scythians and various aspects of their culture and history. And our thinking is that this webinar would be around the 1 hour. We would not end it prematurely. If necessary, we'll carry on until the key questions have been answered. We would be recording it, and it would be then placed on the group for people who were not able to participate to be able to view. Just a few things about the administrative elements of this. The system has been set up to have everyone who joins to be on mute so that the noise doesn't interrupt the presenters. Please do remain muted if you can. Any questions, please put them into the chat as we go along. I will be monitoring them, and hopefully at the end, we will be answering the key questions. We'll try and answer all the questions. We can't promise. And of course, the presenters will also be able to see the questions as they come, if they're in the chat, so that they could frame their answers as they're making their presentations. The questions will be at the end. So we will allow the presenters to have their dialogue with each other and to present to us their materials with a Q&A session at the end of the process. So just a few things. The topic of conversation today is the Scythian bow. The reason that we chose to start our series of webinars with this topic is because we believe the weapon of the bow and this style of bow was absolutely central and a defining feature of this culture. Now, it's got to be said that, and the two experts here will, I'm sure, point this out, that we mustn't be too open to too many generalizations. This is a very loose groupings of confederate tribes that range over a vast territory from the Carpathian Basin all the way to the far end of Asia. And they were around for a considerable period of time, from 1200 BC, as we will see, right the way up to 600 AD. And there is a whole series of change and evolution that would have happened. Not all the tribes would have been the same. Not all the weapons would have been the same. Their uses, their methodology, their construction, we understand would have been different. And they would have been affected by the people who were there in those territories in those times before, and would have affected the people who came after. So that's the general health warning. Plus, none of us were around to see it and say, we know what it was like. There is primary evidence based on archaeological evidence, which is a very strong evidence. There is evidence from secondary sources that report on things on the Scythians. But in all honesty, most of what we're going to say is what we believe was the reality based on balance of probability. That means it's okay to challenge, but the challenge needs to be based on alternative evidence, alternative way of thinking. There is a lot of folklore and fables and stories that are with these wonderful people that affected the culture of so many different nations. And we must separate a lot of the folklore and the fables, which are all valuable, from the reality that we can actually test and be able to deal with. So that's my introduction. And I'd like to now introduce our experts. If I may, I'll start with Professor Stephen Selby first. Stephen's an amazing guy, and I didn't even know where to begin to introduce him, except to say that he's currently, in his professional life, professor at Hong Kong Polytechnic University, where he has been since 2011. He has been professor in many universities, and he's got many honors. The one that jumped out at me was that he's an advisor to Shaolin Monastery and many other honors that follow him, which I'm really, really pleased to know him now and to have this opportunity through this webinar to meet him, be it virtually. He has published many books on topics that he teaches on, but also on archery and on the history of archery, especially Chinese archery and Asian archery. He's also a practitioner. He was the gold medalist, 2 golds and 1 bronze in the first ever international horseback archery competition in Korea. And then in the subsequent years, he's also participated and won medals. So he's a practitioner of the art, which, because I've been a practitioner and Jack's a practitioner, for us is an additional layer of, really understanding what we're talking about. He's currently convener and regular contributor to the Asian Traditional Archery Research Network as well. So a deep expert. So welcome, Stephen. Thank you so much for giving us the time and your expertise.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very honored.
The honor is all ours. Secondly, I'd like to introduce our second expert. Jack Farrell is a lifelong archer. He's one of the specialists that I knew and I befriended very quickly because I could learn things from him. His specialization is not just as an archer, but also as an experimental bow maker. And because anyone who wants to do that needs to understand the topic, he has spent several decades both visiting locations like Uzbekistan and other places to see what in location, what is being done, but also looking at the historical evidence. He's published numerous articles on the history of archery and the history of archery from this area and from this era, including several tours to Central Asian republics. As you can see behind him, he's got some Scythian bows that he has constructed himself. And I think that makes him an amazing person to talk about this particular topic. Now, I think I've talked enough. You're not here to listen to me. We've got the experts. So if I may, Stephen, I would like to pass on the host function to you so that you may present your slides and show and tell. If I may ask, please do start with the funny story of you sleeping with the Scythians.
Yes, okay. Now, I hope all this equipment is going to work all right, and I'm going to just go over to my share screen to do this. And let's go here. And I'm going to ask my system now to do this. As soon as I go to this, it's all trying to show me about something completely different. Let's just start by plonking my hands on these slides and seeing how we go. So here, I hope you can see a map. Are you all with me? Are you able to?
Could you enlarge it, please, Stephen? Because it's we can see your screen, but it's not showing that map in a very large way. Just click on it to enlarge it, please.
Okay, I'm trying to show it full screen. Is that it?
At the moment, we're seeing a series of small pictures on the screen.
Okay, well, that's no good, is it?
Double click.
I'm going to have to stop the screen share and redo it.
Please do.
Because it's being it's being a real nuisance. I think I better go to. I will be there eventually. I do apologize to your audience, who must be very annoyed with me.
I see a menu at the top of the page which has the boxes on it, and I wonder if you were to go to along that and click on the icon that has the big picture with the little one at the bottom, whether it would then present that particular slide. So if you go along that to the menu below that, no, not to the help.
No, okay. The reason was that I had them here, and there used to be something called slideshow.
Oh, there it is, slideshow there. There we are. Perfect.
Okay. Now you get to see that map, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
So you know, I live here. Do you get to see the pointer?
Yes.
Okay. I live down there, and I was up in Turfan, doing some research at the invitation of the institute there, the Archaeological Institute. But the reason for this map is, firstly, it's just a physical map with no real borders, except perhaps a border between Asia and Europe. And we were looking at things starting from about 1100 BCE. And I just wanted people to think about how few human beings were in that area. We reckon, I mean, Hong Kong has now about 6.5 million people in Hong Kong. I don't know how many people there are in your big cities, maybe 11 odd in London, is that right? That is many more people than would have filled most of the area of Central Asia and Siberia in those days. There was a vanishingly small population, very tiny groups who were traveling. And, you know, one tends to think about hordes of nomads. And nomadic life was part of the scene, and agricultural was part of the scene. But people had to move because if small communities, if they didn't move, they would get inbred. So moving was part of the requirement of life in this huge empty area. And one can imagine a situation where maybe people would move according to a fixed calendar, and tribes and groups would meet to trade. I can see these people, particularly from what I've read about Scythians, as great traders. But they did need to move. They just couldn't hang around in one place for a long time. Okay, here we go. Here's the problem starting now. I have to try and find a way to move things. So you see this fellow. He's a friend of mine. I shared a room with him for one night. Do you see him on screen?
Yes.
I was not very well accommodated up near Yanghai, and it was Chinese New Year. It was bitterly cold, but there was some climate conditioning in the storeroom for the Archaeological Institute. And so I had a sort of camp bed there, and it was all right. It was quite warm, but none of the others would come in because I was surrounded by dead bodies. And one thing you don't do in Chinese New Year is spend your Chinese New Year surrounded with dead bodies. So I'm one of the few people who's had the honor to spend the night with Scythians. And that's how it came about. Now, I want to, golly, this is a nuisance. It really is a nuisance. I wish I'd been able to do this the way I wanted to do it originally. And I can't see the screen because my camera is in the way. So let's have a look at the bow that we're talking about today. And when I went up, I was technically not allowed to take any photographs, only drawings. I wasn't allowed to describe the bow as anything else than the Yanghai bow, because that is the archaeologists' like professional tradition in China. So I did my drawings, and when people weren't looking, I did take a few photographs. And we can see one of the bows, and this was actually one that I was finally allowed to take out of China for carbon-14 testing and for further research. It was quite broken, as you can see. It was not the best, but it was more or less complete. And after drawing it, I actually sent the original over to Adam Karpovich, who, after a few months, came up with this pretty well exact copy, which is the one underneath. I call this this photograph Ashes and Phoenix. The phoenix has risen from the ashes. And this bow he made, I could pull it and shoot it, and it was probably no more than 54 pounds. It certainly wasn't in the very, very high poundage. I shot it with only about 28-inch arrows, but probably I didn't draw back to the more than 24 or 25. And it performed very nicely with a very satisfactory thunk, not much vibration. And again, if you can see my mouse pointer, I would hold it there. It's slightly longer in this aspect than it is in that aspect there. And I would hold it there. And for reasons why that I can explain shortly, that was really, really uncomfortable. Anyway, let's move on. So I'm just going to take you quickly through the process. I got from a large cupboard with hundreds of bows. I just chose beginning with something that was fairly well preserved. And I would simply do my drawings by having the bow down. I had a nice little measuring tape, and I would do the drawings as best as I could, and we could go through. I don't think this is going to let me do this anything like as nicely as I would like to have, but then piece by piece I went across doing my drawings, trying to get the exact dimensions, making little notes about what I could see. And what was particularly interesting to me and important, I think, was these lines represent the alignment of the sinew bindings at various parts along the bow, which were very irregular. For me, someone who had only seen bows of the Manchu type or the Turkish type, the way the binding went on this was very very unusual, completely new to me. And then after that, I got some of the broken bows and broken pieces. I would take here you can see dimensions, and all along here then you can see my notes about what I could see in terms of the sinew binding. And here particularly, I want to point out that on most of the bows I looked at, this here is the belly, and this is the back. So as you can see, the belly comes to a point, and this was very consistent in these bows that I saw. They sometimes really quite a sharp point, like I'm showing there. And this was where your hand was when you're holding the bow. Your hand is holding it there with this very sharp thing sticking into my hand. And I couldn't, when I got Adam's reproduction, which was very faithful, I just, couldn't get round that in my mind, how that worked. So here are other broken pieces where I could have a look at how the horn here had been fitted into the wood. Now, no scientific method ever allowed me to work out exactly what the horn was, but there was no problem. There's a scientific method for determining the wood, and the wood was tamarisk. Again, most of the strips were not very long. Here you can see a little bit of cord binding, presumably where things had started to come a little bit unstuck or a bit loose during the use of the bow. Sorry, I'm just whipping through these so that you can see the method that I used and how I was trying to get a look, a sort of X-ray eyes into the inside. Now, here's an interesting thing. The bow was glued on the outside and with sinew, and whatever little insects or bacteria existed in the grave with the bow just loved eating this stuff. And quite a lot of the bow even was quite consistently gnawed away by insects, whereas of course the wood wasn't. Here's an example of the binding that I find. It's rather neat and beautifully done. Obviously binding a weak point. Here we can see a binding with a bit of what seems to be chamois leather. So you can see here some of the sinewing with glue over the wood and the horn, and then the whole at this point has been covered by a binding of leather. But again, it's been eaten away here. One would think maybe rats, but the fact is that the situation in these graves makes it almost impossible to imagine how rodents could have survived. So here again, you can see I've just propped the bow up laterally. You can see the binding, and you can see this binding of some sort of string. Here is a section where you can see how the sinew has been applied. Of course, there's some wood missing on here. It's come away, but you can see that actually wherever you have a severely bent section, there's a crisscross application of sinew over that section. So what we're used to seeing, like I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself, what we're used to seeing in terms of layers of sinew along the back of a bow longitudinally is not followed here at all. So here's the tip of the bow. Again, it's burst out. Here's the horn, which comes down into the string knot with the end remains of the wooden body of the bow. You wouldn't really call it a sear, but I suppose it's where a sear would be on a Turkish bow. Here's the other end, and you can see the same thing. So this is actually the very tip of the horn. And just out of interest, here's the string of one of these bows. And it's common, not just in these bows, but in later bows and even in Xiongnu bows. It's very common that the string knot is covered with chamois leather as a sort of extra reinforcement. And to stop the string is made here of sinew, and it would stop the individual threads of the sinew continuously rubbing, and therefore individually each thread splitting away. So those are just some photographs which take you through the process that I went through to try and study the bows. There were arrows as well. The arrows were about 28 or 29 inches. They were not at all long. And they had bulb ends with quite a shallow knock cut into them, barreled, as I say, and often painted. They were all made of wood, and I'm not sure what wood there was. I didn't see any cane arrows on that location at all, although I have seen some measure of cane arrows in other locations. So I'm going to stop my share there. And so that just takes you through the process. I'd just like to finish with one thing, which always is a little sort of memory bell, a bell that rings in the back of my mind whenever I look at excavated items in archaeology in China. They all come out of graves. Therefore, they all represent items which have some association with funerary rites. They're ritual items. In fact, in the Yanghai Cemetery, for that period of about 300 BCE, all males had a bow and arrows, and in some cases a goritis in the grave. All women had equipment that was associated with sewing leather or sewing other things. These were funerary items. There were one or two burials which had some shamanistic items, including very, very long hats, like wizard hats in the movies. So I'm always a bit cautious in immediately linking what is found in graves with what is used in real life. But it seems to me self-evident that these bows had been used and could have been used. Finally, the bows of the form that I've shown you there in the slides represents the end of an evolution. At the very beginning stage, in about 1100 BC, the bows, they were not straight, but the curvature was much, much less, and the construction was much simpler. As time went on, the curvature got more and more extreme until we got these fantastic curves that you see in the photograph behind your head there. So there was definitely, as far as that particular community was concerned, the Tocharians, an evolution of that sort of bow. So that's what I'd like to present and perhaps hand over back to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Very, very interesting. Jack, any comments and insights about what Stephen presented first before you start your presentation?
Well, you know, for somebody who likes to make experimental bows, I'm endlessly fascinated in exactly how they were done. And we just didn't have any idea about how a Scythian bow was built. You know, as I was telling you in the warm-up that I had a lot of Soviet texts by famous authors like Rudenko and Vasilev translated for me. And there was no information in there that was useful for making a bow. They came to the conclusion that they were composite bows, but you know, it's like, okay, well, how is it? Because we know from having studied the Hun bows that they weren't familiar with this famous V-splicing that the Turkish bows and Korean bows and all later bows seem to have incorporated. So there just wasn't anything there until Stephen found these bows and documented. So we were all tremendously affected by this construction. And if you can get back to the old Atarn, he lays out all those sheets that he laid out here, and you can actually read all of his text and you can just make out. So we don't have to extrapolate anymore on what an Eastern Scythian bow looks like. And I just want to also say that for anybody who's tempted to say, oh, Scythians were this and that, no, a lot of people were using these bows that we know were not Scythians. The Medians use these, the Parthians use these, the Greeks all use these. Our main information on Western Scythian bows would be from Greek artwork. So, but it wasn't until Stephen dared to bring this stuff out. And I wish he'd write a book on Eastern Scythian bows, because the door is kind of closed to going back there right now and collecting this stuff. And his memory seems to be fresh. And I think it would just, whatever number of these books he would publish, it would be a sellout. You know, I immediately get in line to buy several of them just to have them. I wish he'd do that.
Jack, thank you for the suggestion. Wait until about June or July, when I'm contributing to a book called I think it's called The Bows of China. So you'll see some material in there.
Wonderful. I can't wait. I've got all your
to it. So Jack, I've made you the host, so you can actually present your material as and when you want.
Well, thank you, Professors Masood Shirazi and Stephen Selvey, for the invitation to come here today. And thank you very much. Let's see if I can struggle through all this here.
Jack, would you be able to just talk us through what you were going to talk to us about?
Yes, I will. So, my talk was called The Evidence for the Scythian Bow. And the first, I would present this in a chronological order of the evidence that we know. So Herodotus, of course, gave a lot of information on Scythian bow. And the Attic ceramic wares are probably one of the greatest sources of information that we have for those bows. And metal works, Greek metal works, bronze, and especially gold works. They seem to have been trade goods or gifts that were made to Scythians. I'm trying to manipulate this. We get a lot of good information. There's Scythians shown doing various things in Greek style artwork, like stringing bows. And there's a man who's, they're checking their dental work, which is very strange. It seems to be a story that the recipient or the owner of this vessel would have found familiar, but we don't know what that means. There is a very interesting one I like, in which an old bearded man is holding a bow. He also has another bow and a agoritus, and he's offering the bow to the young unbearded man, who I assume might be his son or a relative. And a co-author of mine from Uzbekistan believes that in here lies the story of why the Russians, or I should say, why the Soviets dug 2,000 kurgans in the West and never found a complete bow that we have convincing evidence was actually a useful bow. And that's that the Scythians didn't have crowns, that the symbol of authority to Western Scythian was the bow, and that he received that bow in the story of Herodotus from his father. Scythes received the bow from Hercules, from his father, and that was passed up the two older sons and gave it to the younger son. So he sees in that gold work the story of why we don't find Scythian bows in Western burials, is because they were all digging in kurgans. Maybe if they had dug in common graves like the Yanghai bows in Xinjiang, they might have found something like that. At any rate, there's very scant evidence from the West of Scythian bows. There's some, like the Three Brothers Kurgans has a bow, but I wish I could show you the illustration that there was one found in Siberia called Olan Kurengal, and it was reported on the old HR long ago by one of the members there, who actually was at the dig, and it was put together in a laminated method similar to modern type bows. And reconstruction of that bow drew only 25 pounds. And there's no amount of sinew you can put on a 25-pound bow to turn it into a serious bow. And also the cores had knots on them. No bow maker would make a permanent bow with obvious knots in it. I mean, that's the thing to be totally avoided. So it seems like the layered bows, laminated, I should say, not laminated in the modern sense, but layered in the modern technique, were funerary objects. So
are you saying that Stephen's right about the shape of the bow and the horn of the ibex being a symbolic thing around? Actually, I'm not sure it was Stephen or whether he was his co-author. I remember having this discussion before about whether the symbolic element of the bow derived from this particular sheep and the representation of the moon goddess and whatever.
I have the greatest respect for Stephen and for your site and everything like that. But let me tell you, we are diametrically opposed on that, because these bows in back of me were made with ibex horn. Ibex is a goat, not a sheep.
All right.
There seems to be a great difference between goats and sheep, but these bows are not as good as a wooden bow, like a long bow. So I do not see the Scythians having built an empire on an inferior bow. So I've completely just, and the reason I got onto this idea, I might have planted the idea in Stephen's brain at any rate, because my friend and archaeologist Shelley Waxman wrote a book on how the Egyptians were importing ibex horns. And after I made 4, I made him 2 angular bows, and I made myself these 2 Scythian bows. And both of the Scythian bows I had to take apart and redo, but they're done with the original horn. They're all inferior bows. And also a friend of mine from Bulgaria, Steven Stefanov, has told me recently, and I agree with him totally, that you cannot be arming all these people with a bow that's built from wild animal horns. There simply weren't enough. They were too difficult to come by, these horns. You know, they're difficult to hunt, and even if you find them, I have seen piles from Xinjiang of these horns. It's too difficult. And the cult of the ibex, I mean, the Scythians represented every animal, not just ibex, but if you had to point to a animal for a cult, it would be the griffin, not the ibex, which, you know, some say came from remains from the Gobi Desert of Triceratops dinosaurs, when they're finding the whole skulls and everything with a monster beak on them on the ground. I mean, there is a cult of ibex in Persia. I'm aware of that. They have found some famous pieces. But I mean, there's far more representations of moose than there are among the Scythians than there are of ibex. So I just, you know, and a griffin has a hooked beak, and an eagle has a hooked claw, and a cat has a hooked claw. So any animal could be, you know, likened to the hook on a Scythian bow. Let me go on.
Please.
Coins are a good source of information, like the King Attaius, if I'm saying that correctly, 340 BC. Coin shows him with a bow. A king, you could not be a king in antiquity if you weren't associated with archery. It just wasn't done. They make a big deal out of King Tut. He was handicapped. You know what I mean? Probably couldn't walk well, and he certainly couldn't draw a strong bow. They have inscriptions on his bows that he could put an arrow through a copper oxide ingot. It's insanity. You know what I mean? But they had to make him up to be a great king. So you couldn't have a bow. You couldn't be a king if you didn't have a bow. So Stephen broke the ice. I also have an illustration from a archaeological presentation that was done last year on bows from Ukraine, and none of them is in decent enough condition to reconstruct or make any statement about, in my opinion. I haven't looked at any of them personally, but they're in just too poor shape to give an opinion on their construction. Bronze points, we have tens of thousands of bronze points from battle sites and manufactured sites, so we know what their bows, their arrowheads look like. We still have some arrows from Xinjiang. I have to say that there's quite a difference between apparently between Eastern Scythian style bow and Western Scythian style bows. You cannot fit an Eastern bow into a Western Gorichus. It won't fit. They're too big. So they were drawing them shorter, and there would be advantages to shooting a shorter bow. I have to say also, they seem to enjoy using the face as a main target, because there's a lot of representations of them aiming their bows at each other's faces. There's a man from Arzan who died from an apparent arrow wound to the cheek. So, and there's other examples in Hun and whatever. So, and a Tsubishi bow toured Europe in the early 2000s. Stephen's Yanghai bows are the most solid evidence we have at all of Scythian bows. And we don't know what the similarity is of the constructions of those bows between east and west. I suspect that Western Scythian bows are layered because their grave goods look like that. But, you know, they found the one in Siberia that was layered, and they were obviously not building them there. They also found remains in Kazakhstan of Scythian bows in which the hook was a single piece of wood bent over, which makes a lot more sense actually than the way the Yanghai bows are the three pieces glued together with a piece of horn in the center. Horn is dead weight on the tip of a bow. We know that. They had a belly, the Yanghai bows had a belly of horn, but stopped before it got to the hooks. So putting horn into the hooks is also dead weight, and that evolved a way in antiquity of doing things like that. We had some arrow decorations, mostly rings around the fletching area. At any rate, I propose that Scythian bow was either made with domestic sheep horn, cattle from cold weather, such as some places in Hungary are very useful for making bows. So it's probably even colder in Siberia and Xinjiang in the winter. So their cattle might have been more useful, and not ibex, but also wild sheep such as our galley that came from there. I really apologize for how my presentation has come out. And
no, perhaps Jack, you wouldn't mind doing a post with the presentation in it to sort of share that information on the group later on. But we're coming up to the hour, so I wanted to move to the questions and answer session, if I may.
Let's do that.
Okay. So look, can I ask the participants to please put their questions as they have them in the chat, and I will ask, or I could ask you to unmute and ask yourself, since we don't have that many participants, frankly, which might be more fun anyway. But I wanted to start with a question that I think we talked about before we started the full meeting, Stephen, which was what's the normal weight of the bows that you found? I mean, you talked about the draw of 24 to 26 inches, but what's the sort of power of the bow that you were talking about for the Scythians?
Oh, I think it would be very difficult to answer that question, because all we have is, I mean, who has done faithful reproductions? Jack and Adam Karpovich. And from a conversation with Jack some time ago, you know, I mentioned that the bow that Adam made for me and sent to me was in the 50 to 60 range, but that Jack had heard of a bow that he'd made which was much, much heavier. So assuming that these were very, very effective weapons, however they were constructed, and that the arrows were relatively short, I would have thought that around 50 pounds was the minimum.
Yes.
And in any case, as I have found with all properly constructed horn bows, if you have light ones, they don't work well. Just the weight of the bow in terms of its actual physical weight in hand compared with its draw weight is too much. And then I'm always skeptical of the need to go really up towards the you know, the 80, 90 pound mark, because you have to fight a battle, you have to go hunting, you may have a quiver with you know, 50 or 60 arrows. You've got to keep on doing this, and the value of having this hugely heavy bow that's over 80 or 90 pounds, in my mind, I'm not quite sure what the value is, although I accept that the people were much fitter and stronger who were using them. So I think minimum 50, but on the upper limit, I can't really comment.
Okay. I mean, the question that Bud has just asked is, I think, is the continuation of what you were saying, Stephen. But Jack, perhaps you could answer this to say, based on the reproductions that we have, faithful reproductions, what would be the range of a bow like that? What would be the penetrating power of it? I think Stephen's absolutely right. The historical evidence is that all the civilizations of the time absolutely saw Scythian archers as a weapon of choice for them to hire or to use on battlefield, which means that at some they were effective. I think that's a probability we can agree, and that means penetrating power, rate of fire, and range. So those, for me, I mean, we're all archers, so perhaps you guys can correct me. Those are the things. How many arrows can you put in the air in a minute? So how fast is the recovery of the bow? And what's the penetrating power of the arrow with the right point and everything else? And what's the range? Jack, what do you think?
Well, I hate to disagree with Stephen because I see him as one of my main teachers and mentors. But as soon as he published this bow on the old ATARN in 2005, I believe it was, I set out to build one of these bows. And I used his exact cross sections, his length, and the dimensions of the materials and everything, and built it just as faithfully, as I possibly could to the exact dimensions. And my original bow drew 120 pounds.
Wow!
And I could, I had to make a machine just to get it strung because I couldn't pull it back at all. I've never been a powerful archer, but Adam finished his bow about 6 weeks before I finished mine. Maybe he had a heads up on the plans and everything, but I remember him saying that his bow was 120 pounds. And I think maybe he just built another one that was more shootable. I had to eventually scrape all of the sinew off of this bow and put it on my bandsaw and cut about 40% of the bow away, and then put the horn back on, and it still came out to be a 70-pound bow, which I can't draw very effectively at any rate. Now, I say it didn't have good cast, but it still had the draw weight. The cast and the draw weight are two different things. These are not fast bows, but these are reproductions. So, and Adam used to beat everybody on that constantly. I mean, they pull up the Mary Rose out of the channel, and the lightest bow was 90 pounds, as I remember. And they topped out around 135 and maybe 100.
No, more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So certainly, and drawing a heavy bow is a technique like powerlifting. You don't just use brute force to grab those things up. You do it in little sessions, and you throw it upwards and jump underneath it and push it up. Pulling back a war bow is the same thing. You will hurt yourself. You will send yourself to the hospital, and you will detach tendons from the bone if it's not done properly. But at any rate, and that's Adam Karpowitz's teaching that he used to go on and on about. And everybody used to say, no, I've been shooting my whole life and I can only shoot a 50-pound bow. That's me. That was me 10 years ago. I'm down to 35-pound bow. I'm an old man, and that's the best I can do right now because of my occupation as a carpenter. So anyway, 120 pounds, the answer to your question.
120 pounds. I mean,
they were superhuman compared to us.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a 65-pounder, and I really struggled with it. But there you go. Stephen, in the bodies that were discovered, was there any evidence of injuries from the archery? Like, I mean, I know archers who, if you like, as Jack said, start pulling very powerful bows, probably not with the right techniques long, and they all get neck ache or particularly asymmetrical features on the skeletal and muscular structure. Was there any evidence of that kind of thing in the bodies?
I never asked the question, and I've never seen it commented upon. I'm not sure to what extent those mummies have actually been X-rayed. The clothes have been taken off them, their bodies have been looked at, and I haven't read reports about injuries, either superficial or internal bone deformation. As far as battle technique was concerned, I think the other thing that's strongly associated with these archers was poison arrows.
Yes.
And it was clear that they regarded both that their horses needed armor and that they themselves needed armor. And the armor was a lamella armor made of rawhide, toughened rawhide. So it was lighter than the metal lamella armor, but still pretty heavy. And what I saw had a layer of silk or similar material on the inside. And that, of course, also helps once the energy of the arrowhead has been absorbed initially by the lamella armor. If it doesn't deflect, it does go through, then probably the layer of silk will do the rest to absorb the energy and to avoid penetration. But
I'd heard, Stephen, that the silk was used, I mean, please correct me, in being able to pull the arrow out without leaving fragments inside, which can then fester and create gangrene and whatever. And that's why the underlayer of silk was worn, so that if you're penetrated by an arrow, you could pull the arrowhead out easier without causing additional damage. And also it wouldn't leave any material inside the wound. But I could be wrong.
Well, if the body was pierced, I think that the silk wouldn't inhibit the poison from getting in, but it might help a bit. But I don't know what people's sources for that are. And I don't know if anybody's tried any experiments, rather you than me. But I'm pretty sure that, I mean, to be honest, on ATAN and on other fora, I've studiedly avoided discussing arrow poisons. I have the formulas for the poisons. I have the formulas for getting rid of the poisons, and I've never been prepared to discuss any of that. But I think that the use of poisons in the battle, and even to a limited extent in the hunt, for example, if you are hunting wolves, which you are unlikely to try and eat, or tigers, which I don't know to what extent they would eat tigers, but I rather think they didn't, then probably poison played a role there.
Sure. And again, before you were saying that most of the arrows were three-headed, three-pointed arrows that the Scythians were using. And I think I did a post on the group about the evolution. There was a paper on the evolution of the arrow heads as well that was being used. But if the armor was not metal, then of course that means that the arrowhead doesn't need to be anything like a bodkin point or anything like that. It could be a cutting point, I guess.
A word of caution about arrowheads. Arrowheads were small metal tradable objects, and they were traded over huge areas. And of the arrowheads I saw, some of them obviously came from the Far East. That is what I would call the contemporaneous with the Tocharians, the Proto-Koreans. Different sorts of arrowheads are ending up everywhere in excavations. You might luckily come up with a mold where arrowheads were being cast, and then you say, okay, then those types of arrowheads came from here. And sometimes in Chinese burials of nobles, there was a consistent design of arrowheads. But in many other excavations, there's quite a mishmash.
Okay. Jack, one final question. I think we might be coming to an end. What about the draw style of the bow? Based on drawings and pictures that we have and whatever, I'm sure there was a whole variety that were being used, but what would you think would be the most common draw style?
I don't think you can put an answer to that exactly. The Greeks show every conceivable type of draw being used, and novel type draws, a Scythian draw, two middle fingers, and thumb draws and finger draws, and I don't think you can put a name on that. But one of the themes that interests me a lot is where you seem to be seeing the archer shooting with the bow upside down, with the large limb facing down instead of up. And if the bow is highly asymmetric, you can actually grab the bow in a strange way like that. This is a copy of the Tsubishi bow, which is highly asymmetrical. And you could conceivably be holding it by the, by the upper limb upside down. But all the Yanghai bows have the built-up area in the middle of the curve. And so you're actually holding it sort of like the Japanese do, with the hand facing forward and not from the middle. So I think...
I mean, that bow, because of the roundness of the hold, once you've shot, I guess the energy of it wants to make it twist round. Am I wrong? For it to twist this way rather than the Turkish or the others that tend to push the energy forward, does that roll in your hand once you've shot?
It does. It feels normal when you shoot it, but if you had to make some observation, it's as you're drawing it, your hand increasingly goes forward. Because of the asymmetry, the top bends much more than the lower. The lower limb is actually the stronger limb, and the upper limb is the weaker limb, and the upper limb bends more than the lower. But you would expect that if you know. Other than that, I don't find any difference in shooting an asymmetric bow of how it feels. It hits the target, you aim, you get used to it, your brain gets used to it, and then it just becomes, it's hard to actually make a statement like that.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so I think we're coming to an end. Just remains for me to thank you two for sharing all this very interesting information with us. I certainly found it an educational process, and I hope our participants and our fellow group members found it interesting as well. Really appreciate it. And Jack, please do share your slides on a post if you can. Hopefully we'll be doing other webinars going forward, possibly on the religion, on textiles, on the horse. There's no shortage of really interesting material for us to bring experts to talk about and to make that a feature of our group going forward. I do want to thank you guys for your time, everybody for participating. As I said at the beginning, I will try to edit the bits around the technology problem and then post the remainder of the interesting presentation we've had onto the group. So anybody who, one of your friends who hasn't participated, please let them know that will be coming. Thank you very much, and I wish you a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Hope I haven't stepped on you too hard.
No, I'm used to being stepped on.
And I would love to continue the discussion with you guys, and anything I could ever do to help with anything, with research or whatever else, please do feel that there's an invitation open for you to participate with me in any way.
Thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Yeah,
I'm leaving the meeting now. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone. See you.